It's just about 2.5 weeks into the 2024-2025 NHL season, and it is time for a game of Edmonton Oilers fact or fiction.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Friday edition of Locked On Oilers. Happy Friday. You made it. Thank everybody who's making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. I am your host, Nick Zararis, and we are going to dive into some of the big early season storylines surrounding the Edmonton Oilers. Now, I'll be honest. The idea for this episode came from Hunter Hodes and I tackling yesterday's edition of Locked On NHL, where we did this concept for a league-wide basis. We talked about if John Tortorella is on the hot seat, if the Minnesota Wild are for real, if Tom Wilson is going to make Team Canada for the Four Nations face-off, if the Predators and Avalanche are in serious trouble, how good the Rangers and Stars actually are, and quite a bit more. So I highly encourage you to check it out. But today's show, obviously, this is an Oilers program, so we are going to center our show around the Edmonton Oilers, and we are going to tackle some of the big questions surrounding the team right now. So question number one for our fact or fiction: the Edmonton Oilers not offer sheeting Philip Broberg was a mistake. Of course, there are a lot of considerations to put in play here. We have to talk about this from both a hockey perspective, a financial perspective, and a roster perspective. So from a hockey perspective, yes, absolutely. Philip Broberg would be the Oilers' third best defenseman. I have no reservations in my mind about that evaluation based on the way he has played in St. Louis on what is not the most talented team. I don't think by any stretch of the imagination the Blues are a particularly good team or that they are particularly dangerous. But make no mistake about it, when you look at the Blues, Broberg's averaging 19 minutes a game. He's playing top 4 minutes, and he's put up 6 points in 7 games. At face value, not even getting into the underlying numbers, not looking into how sustainable it is. I think in the micro, in the 3 weeks we have been discussing the Oilers, there's been no bigger storyline in terms of personnel than the fact they keep rotating, whether it's Emberson and Stetcher, Emberson and Dermott, whichever two of those three draw into the lineup on a given day, it is still a crapshoot. I think Stetcher has more or less solidified himself, and I think it'll be more Dermott and Emberson rotating in and out depending on the matchup, depending on the context of the given matchup. But if Broberg is here and he's playing with Darnell Nurse, well, they don't sign Dermott to a PTO. Stetcher is the 7th defenseman, and Emberson is playing with Brett Kulak, and they are trying to figure this out one game at a time. And look, I expect the Oilers to figure it out defensively because, as I keep saying, don't talk to me about the Oilers defense until they start scoring goals. They have 14 goals through 7 games, 2 goals a game for a team that features 2 past Hart Trophy winners, a 100-point forward and a 50-goal forward. It's not acceptable to only have 14 goals through 7 games. So I do expect the Oilers offense to start to bail out the defense at some point. But as far as the bigger picture and the roster planning, they didn't match because they didn't have the money. It's that straightforward. The Oilers could have absolutely found a way to keep Broberg to match the offer the Blues made, but the Blues made an expensive offer because for the Blues, the cap space isn't very important because they know they're not a Stanley Cup contender. Whereas the Oilers, who are Stanley Cup contenders, Stanley Cup favorites coming into the season, every last dollar was crucial. And it's why they were so cautious in the decisions they made after they got offer sheeted, why they had to do a salary dump trade and send Cody Ceci to the Sharks and bring back Ty Emberson. Look, I get the hand the Oilers were dealt. Some of it was by their own doing. They did spend a little too liberally in free agency, Skinner, Arvidsson, giving raises to Corey Perry and Calvin Pickard, guys who not going to play a lot. So it's a little bit difficult to encourage those types of signings. I understand you want to reward players for strong performances or important performances, but at the end of the day, you can't be playing a fourth line forward who's going to play maybe 50 some odd games, $1.2 million a season. You just can't do that. But the money is why this doesn't happen. Look, if the money were no object, I understand this would have happened. Broberg would very much be playing, but I think the simple fact is it was a mistake not to match the offer sheet compensation. But I understand why they had to do it. I don't know if how good Broberg is going to be long-term. Obviously, he's still under 100 career games in the regular season. He still very much needs to figure out who he is as a player. And even if he were here in Edmonton, I do think expecting him to carry Darnell Nurse would be very difficult. And this first question ties nicely into my second question. Fact or fiction? The Edmonton Oilers should break up Mattias, Ekholm, and Evan Bouchard at even strength to better distribute the defense throughout their lineup. So in their minutes together, the Oilers have 66% of the scoring chances, 42% of the goals, 63% of the expected goals, 71% of the high danger chances. They have an on-ice shooting percentage of 4.17 and an on-ice save percentage of 904. So that tells me they can't get a goal to go in right now. With 4% shooting, and look, they get all their minutes with McDavid. McDavid's played a lot with Draisaitl, and they still haven't gotten going. I think if you continue to have this wonky of results down your defense, I think it's worth a consideration. In the non-Bouchard Ekholm minutes at 5-on-5, the Oilers have 51% of the scoring chances, 25% of the goals for, 47% of the expected goals, 47% of the goals, 48% of the high danger chances. They have 3% on ice shooting and a 901 save. All of those numbers tell me that in the Ekholm Bouchard minutes, the Oilers are outright dominating the game. They just can't get the puck to go in. And then when they're not on the ice, it is pure survival. And some of that is tied to who they play forward with. You're not going to get as many McDavid shifts with Nurse as you are Bouchard shifts with McDavid. So when you have that type of an aggressive roster split and that we really try and get Bouchard with McDavid out there as much as possible, so we dominate those minutes, those 20 some odd minutes a game those guys have together, we're getting 70% of the expected goals, 70% of the high danger chances. But when the puck doesn't go in, it becomes doubly agonizing because not only are you not winning their minutes, you're losing the other minutes too. It creates a really dangerous effect, and that is the peril of having such a top-heavy lineup. The simple fact that if your big dogs do not deliver, it is not realistic to expect your bottom half of the lineup guys to make up the difference. It's just not doable. And this is doubly pronounced when you play McDavid and Draisaitl together. And look, I understand, and I advocate when the offense is as dry as it is right now. And most of it is because of finishing luck, not because they're not getting the chances. When it is this dire to get offense, put McDavid with Draisaitl together. Let's get going. Let's get one line going. And then once we get some offense, then we can start talking about fancy stuff, splitting McDavid and Draisaitl, moving guys throughout the lineup. I get it. I really do. I really, really, really do get what they're trying to do. But right now, as dire as things are, they got to get going. And if they don't get going, you got to find ways to move some talent throughout your lineup. And splitting Ekholm and Bouchard up is one way to do that. Now, I don't know if you're going to get as good of results in the Bouchard Nurse minutes and the Ekholm whomstever of the right-handed defenseman or Dermott that we've been talking about. But if you at least distribute some of the responsibility a little bit more evenly throughout the lineup, you might be able to muster up better results. But we are going to take our first break of today's edition of Locked On Oilers. And when we come back, we're going to continue Fact or Fiction. Today's show is brought to you by our friends over at PrizePicks. You can win up to 100 times your money on PrizePicks with as little as 4 correct picks. PrizePicks is the only real money daily fantasy platform with an injury insurance policy, so your lineups stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. If your player leaves in the first half and doesn't return, PrizePicks keeps your lineup live. PrizePicks is the best place to get real money sports action. Join over 10 million users and sign up today. PrizePicks puts its members first, so all withdrawals are fast, safe, and secure. When my picks hit, I can get my money in as quick as 15 minutes. Sign up today and get $50 instantly when you play $5. You don't even need to win to receive the $50 bonus. It is guaranteed. Tonight, if you were to pull up the PrizePicks landing page, you could figure out whether or not Aaron Jones is going to have more than 72.5 rushing yards. If you think Matthew Stafford's going to hit Tutu Atwell for a bomb in this game on Thursday Night Football, you could do more than 33.5 receiving yards for Tutu Atwell or more than 242 passing yards for Matthew Stafford. All you need to do is head on over to PrizePicks. So download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $50 instantly after you place your first $5 lineup. Again, download the app, use code LOCKEDONNHL, and you'll get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. PrizePicks, run your game. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on today's edition of Locked On Oilers, where we are setting you up for the weekend. The Oilers are taking on the Pittsburgh Penguins tonight. I assume by the time you're listening to this episode, you will have seen the quote yesterday that Connor McDavid very, very diplomatically laughed when he was asked who should the captain be of Team Canada at the Four Nations face-off next year, because it's obviously Sidney Crosby. And don't get me wrong, at this stage, we all know Connor McDavid is better than Sidney Crosby. But what Sidney Crosby means to the cultural fabric of the nation of Canada and what he means to guys like McDavid and McKinnon, it's silly, but I understand why the question was asked. You got to ask the question. But yeah, we know it's Crosby's team. We know Sid is going to wear the C. I imagine McDavid and McKinnon will be alternates, but I cannot wait to get to February. That Four Nations face-off is going to be such a great spectacle. It's going to be such a great showcase for the game. And speaking of showcases, the next question in our little game of fact or fiction, Darnell Nurse has the worst contract in the entire NHL. And this one, you got to do some investigating, because anecdotally, if you're watching the Oilers every night and you are watching a guy actively hinder the team's ability to win, and he's one of the highest paid players on the team, one of the highest paid players at his position in the entire league, you're naturally going to be like, well, who's worse? So, being that you asked, you can make an argument for Jonathan Huberdeau of the Calgary Flames, who is under contract for 6 more years at $10.5 million per season. For context, Evolving Wild, which is a data analytics company, they estimated Jonathan Huberdeau's value last season to be $200,000 against the salary cap. And he got paid $10.5 million. If you're wondering what the conversion is on that, 2%. The Flames got 2% of the contract value. 2%, not 2%. They got 2% of the value of Jonathan Huberdeau's contract. So we are talking about a cataclysmically bad contract. And look, a lot of these bad contracts, when you look at them, you understand why they're signed. We also have Seth Jones of the Chicago Blackhawks, who's under contract for 6 more seasons at $9.5 million. He's worth about half that, about $4 million against the salary cap. And then there's Pierre-Luc Dubois, who's on the Capitals now, but was worth negative value to the Los Angeles Kings last season. So with that in mind, I want to make this point because I do think it's important. Darnell Nurse was never going to be worth the contract he was offered. He had opportunity meet the perfect storm. He had a perfect storm of external factors put him in a position in a contract year to maximize his value and get as much money as he possibly could. To have a career high in points in a weird season in a division that was all Canada, if you'll recall the 2021 56-game season, where only the Canadian teams played each other. There was no defense played. The games were very high scoring. They were very chaotic. The Sens, born brought the sicko meme to life because they kept beating teams like the Leafs and the Habs. They both fired their coaches, if I remember correctly. No, Sheldon Keefe didn't get fired for that. It wasn't Sheldon Keefe. It was Montreal who got, because Ducharme got fired. And I can't remember the other coach. It might have been Travis Green or the Canucks, but I forget. At this point, you get what I'm saying. Perfect storm of factors. Nurse cashes out. You look at Seth Jones. He got that contract because Stan Bowman was very desperate to keep the Blackhawks as a competitive team with Kane and Tays still on the team. So they do the Seth Jones deal. They trade for Marc-Andre Fleury. And they really think they're going to be a playoff team. Obviously, that hasn't come to fruition. And Seth Jones isn't atrocious. He's just not worth that much money. I honestly, and this might be a little bit of the Oilers homer in me, I think the Huberdeau's contract is worse because he gets paid more money. They're under term for about the same amount of time, but it was so obvious that it was an aberration. I still don't understand how Huberdeau finished like 5th in Hart Trophy voting 3 years ago. Like, I get it. He had 120 points. The Panthers won the President's Trophy. He got down ballot votes. But anybody who watched, who's familiar with the Panthers, who understands what drives them, Sasha Barkov's team, man, it is absolutely insane that Huberdeau got that contract. And I understand that Brad Treliving gave that contract knowing he probably wasn't going to have to deal with the repercussions of it, but that contract is an atrocity. That is, I wholeheartedly believe the Huberdeau contract is the worst in the entire NHL. And look, I understand he's off to a really strong start this year, that the Flames are playing really, really above their weight. They're friggin' 5-0-1. Huberdeau is playing reasonably well. He's got 6 points in 6 games. I understand all of that. I struggle to say the Nurse contract is worse because the Oilers are going to find a way. I think as the cap explodes over the next handful of years and we get more liquidity in the market, I think the Oilers are going to find it a little bit more palatable to either retain salary in a trade or just outright buy him out to make the contract to go away once they have a little bit more cap space. But in the short term, man, it is brutal to be paying someone actively costing your team games $9.25 million per season. I mean, the 2 regulation Carolina goals happen because Nurse just, his positioning isn't good enough and his skating isn't good enough. He got beat down the middle and then he chased the puck behind the net. And it's just night after night, those shifts are like, they're like playing a game of chicken. You know, if you're standing in traffic and dare the car to hit you, the car's going to hit you. Like, if the car is coming, it's going to go through you at a certain point. The Oilers are going to need to accept it. And we saw good results in the playoffs last year, the game 6 and 7 against Vancouver, where they dropped his minutes down to about 16 per game. That got better results. He got easier matchups. He played less moments to exploit him, less mistakes. And all of that should have been your takeaway. But instead, the Oilers are stubbornly trying to get the value out of that contract by jamming a square peg into a round hole. And sports just don't work like that. You can give a guy infinite opportunities. That doesn't necessarily guarantee he's going to figure it out. So although I think Nurse is the worst contract on the Oilers, I don't think he's the worst contract in the NHL. I personally think the Huberdeau contract is worse. We're going to take one more quick break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. Then we're going to hit on 2 more of these fact or fiction questions, send you guys on into the weekend, so be sure to stick around. Hey, NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You can get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. This weekend in the NFL, big games. We've got the Eagles and Jalen Hurts heading to Cincinnati to take on Joe Burrow and the Bengals. The Bengals, 2.5-point home favorites. Old school AFC North, Baltimore Ravens, 8.5-point road favorites going to Cleveland. Jameis Winston's first start as the Browns quarterback. My favorite game of the weekend, should be very high scoring back and forth. The Buffalo Bills taking on the Seattle Seahawks. Josh Allen's first ever time heading to Lumen Field to take on the Seahawks. The Bills, 3.5-point road favorites. Sunday Night Football, Cowboys, Niners, good old school NFC rivalry, the 49ers, who are in dire straits, 4.5-point home favorites. And then Monday Night Football, the Danny Jones last stand going to Pittsburgh. The Steelers, 6.5-point home favorites against the New York Football Giants. You want to get in on the action, head on over to FanDuel.com to get started. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out with me here on this Friday afternoon as we navigate the turbulent waters of the early NHL season. And I think after last year, everybody understands just how quick the Oilers can turn it on. I don't expect a 16-game winning streak at any point in December or January. I don't expect, the miscellaneous second 8 or 9-game winning streak either, but the offense will come. When you are generating this much 5-on-5 offense, I do earnestly believe the goals are going to start to flow. And the power play needs to get going, and that naturally transitions us to our next Fact or Fiction question. The Oilers need to change their power play units, and fact, the Oilers, at least in practice, on Thursday morning, had changed the way their power plays were aligned. So they dropped Bouchard to the second power play. They dropped Nugent-Hopkins, and they dropped Zach Hyman to the second power play. They bumped Ekholm up, and they bumped Skinner and Arvidsson to the first power play. So you are going to get a very different look, especially on that first power play unit. I think getting Bouchard off of the first power play is about getting more variety in the looks the Oilers are generating. You've heard me talk a lot on the show through 2 weeks that Bouchard is taking a lot of shots and they're not getting through. This is somebody who 40% of his scoring chances were shots on goal last year. And right now it's about 20%, about half of that. And I understand a lot of that comes from the Oilers trailing in a lot of games. So Bouchard naturally is going to be firing pucks a lot. The Oilers are going to be trailing in these games, and the other team is going to take a more defensive posture. They're going to be deeper. They're going to be in better position to block shots, and they're going to be more inclined to let Bouchard take those crummy point shots because they're more likely to result in not goals. So in changing the looks, you get Skinner out there, who's a really good skater and a really good shooter. I don't know how they're going to align. I don't know which of Arvidsson or Skinner is going to get the Nugent-Hopkins spot on the left flank. I don't know if they're going to adjust the Hyman spot, if Arvidsson is just going to stand at the net mouth, very reminiscent of what Zach Hyman does to be a net front presence. I imagine in an ideal world, they will eventually get back to the power play unit of last year where you ran the league. You had Nuge, you had Hyman, you had Bouchard, you had Draisaitl, you had McDavid, and you had the dangerous power play because of all the different ways they could kill you. I did that episode on a Monday a few weeks ago where we broke out the dry erase board and we analyzed all the different ways the Oilers used the 1-3-1 to their advantage because all 5 of the guys on the ice were a threat to score. Now, Ekholm does shoot a lot for a defenseman, but I assume he's going to be a little bit more choosy on the power play, and he's out there to be more of a conductor than to be a shooter. I do think we'll get back to Bouchard running the point because he's such a sublime shooter for a defenseman. But right now, the Oilers got to continue to get pucks on net, and they got to win some of these battles. And I know that's very rudimentary and simplistic as far as analysis that they need to win more puck battles, but they keep getting the puck to the net mouth in those high danger areas, but they're not scoring. So if you're not scoring, you got to change something. Right now, they're opting for the personnel. If the personnel continues to struggle, I could see a world where they adopt a slightly different positioning or a position orientation of where players are when we start the alignment once they've gained the zone. Maybe you move Draisaitl a little bit closer to the half wall to put him in more of a facilitator role just to get something going. And look, I get Draisaitl's their best shooter on the power play, that from that bottom, that near flank, he's almost unassailable. And we've really dove into it on that episode where the Oilers get you playing in a phone booth where they get it from 5-on-4 to 4-on-3 in a really condensed space. And you get the goalie and the defenseman who are down around the net mouth moving. And that's the best scoring play, especially because Draisaitl can score on that short side near post high in a way that not a lot of guys can. Stamkos can do that on the opposite side. Zibanejad does that on the opposite side. Kucherov does it from the Draisaitl side, but you need to find a way to get the special teams going. Next up, and the last fact or fiction question on today's show. This is one we did on Locked On NHL. The Stanley Cup champion will come from the Western Conference. Fact or fiction? I still say fact. I think when you lay it out, West versus East, the West is significantly deeper. The Oilers and Canucks have yet to get going. I fancy them both high-level contenders. The Dallas Stars are out of the gate very strong. I know they are Stanley Cup contenders. Vegas has yet to really get going. I think they are serious Stanley Cup contenders. And then I know Colorado and Nashville are off to god-awful starts. They are playing terribly. Don't count them out just yet. The season is young. And then the Jets. Can't forget about Connor Hellebuck and the Winnipeg Jets. You compare that to the Eastern Conference, where it's really just the Rangers and the Panthers as far as Stanley Cup. I think the Devils are pretty good. They have a lot of talent. They got to put it all together. They still are really struggling defensively. Luke Hughes drew back in for them last night, but still not great at defense, even though I think he's a pretty talented player. I think just based on sheer probability, the Stanley Cup champion likely comes out of the West. But the one caveat to that is what we saw happen last year, that the West was so good that everyone really beat up on each other. The Oilers came out of the gate a little slow in that Cup final against Florida. And look, I don't think they played bad. And not to relitigate the Stanley Cup final from 5 months ago, but I don't think the Oilers played all that bad in the first 3 games that they lost. Yeah, they probably could have won game 1 if they didn't get ice tilted, where they lost 3-0, but controlled play almost the entire way. People forget Zach Hyman had a great scoring chance 10 seconds into that game. Hyman scores, you might have a very fundamentally different Stanley Cup final. But all of that said, I still feel reasonably confident that the Oilers are going to get this thing going, and relatively in short order. Pittsburgh is an atrocious defensive team. I think the Oilers are getting exactly what they needed. The Penguins are embroiled in a goalie controversy. Even their good defensemen in Chris Letang and Erik Karlsson are both having really slow starts defensively. The Penguins' bottom 6 is not very talented. It does not have a lot of speed. Even if you don't think that much of Connor Brown and Mattias Janmark, I think the Oilers will have a really good chance of winning those bottom 6 minutes and being able to win this game. And the Oilers got to start winning, especially these gimmies. I don't think Pittsburgh is the worst team in the league, but Pittsburgh is the epitome of mediocrity. And the Oilers, if they're good as we think they are, great teams beat up on mediocre teams. And I know the Oilers' record isn't good, and I know your record is what it says. Your record is what you are, word to Bill Parcells, but the Oilers are better than the Penguins. They need to go out there and prove it. I will talk to you guys on Monday. If you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, take an extra second, leave the show a 5-star review. If you're watching over on YouTube, like, comment, let me know fact or fiction on the questions we asked on today's show. Hit the alarm bell so you get a notification whenever new content goes live. Everyone have a safe and fun weekend. I will talk to you guys on Monday, hopefully after an Oilers win.